Hello and welcome to this very special interview. Today we have Associate Professor of Economics and someone who comments on economics, Professor at OP Jindal School, if I'm not wrong. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to do this interview. Sir, what is your overall assessment of the budget today that was presented by our Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman ji?
Well, I would say, if it's very difficult to put it out in like a few lines, but I would say it was a budget that definitely had a pro-growth outlook,
Yeah, yeah.
a very clear and more aggressive push on government spending in trying to develop more of what you would call as capital expenditure or capital investment opportunities in areas of infrastructure. It was something which was, I think, anticipated and expected, apart from a higher outlay for healthcare expenditure, because given the fact we're still in midst of a pandemic,
Yeah.
it was expected to have a very high amount of spending in that regard. But if you look at it from the finer details, the many things that one would have probably felt, given the fact the finance minister herself was titling and calling this as once in a century opportunity in terms of having a budget which would look at something which has never been seen before. I would probably say that a lot was expected on the count of trying to help those who need government help the most, which is those coming in from the vulnerable sections of the working class, which has been worse impacted. We did see that the stock market responded pretty well to
Yeah.
the budget announcements, given that, see, the corporate class and the asset owners who really made money during the period of time which was last year. We've got now enough data from CMIE's own outlook in Provis that profitability had enhanced, and wages had actually been cut down. So I think on terms of trying to cater to the needs of the middle income class, women who have been worse impacted from the unemployment crisis, clearly those groups were left out from the budget's main macro push. But we'll dive into it as we move
Yeah.
forward.
So, sir, if I were to ask you, how do you see this whole budget? Was it a farmer's budget or middle class or middleman class budget? Was the emphasis laid more
I
in this
don't,
budget?
I, yeah, I don't think there was any such group. Directionally, the idea, it seemed from the speech as well, was very clear that the government is trying to lay out a mechanism by which there is a push for greater spending for infrastructural development,
Mm-hmm.
which over a period of time should ideally crowd in more private investment. To give you an example, if a government announces a major push for infrastructure, let's say roads and highways, automatically the demand and the cement company, the stocks of cement companies went up, right? Just to give an example, which meant what? That there is a greater confidence that those who are in the production of cement anticipate, because now there is going to be greater spending that the government would be doing in road and highways. So it's great for, let's say, cement manufacturing and cement production. The idea is over a period of time, maybe this would create more jobs for companies which have those large scale capacities. So the question you need to be asking, is it something which does a lot out for certain groups which have been worse impacted? And I would argue that not really. There was, and in terms of direct allocations for PM Kisan, or if you would see for looking at other overheads as well, there's not much in terms of what could have happened. Education is another area
Yeah.
which they were just macro superficial points about what kind of regulatory. This is something which happens. I've been seeing it like last 4 or 5 years at least in terms of the speeches. There is always this discussion of a higher education commission and higher education regulation. It never really unpacks itself, but you have to really understand one of the worst impacted sectors in education has left many people suffering from what you would call as a digital gulf,
Yeah.
right? Girl child education has gone to the back, particularly in rural sectors and areas. So there has to be, there was a possibility of using as an opportunity for enhancing greater government spending, not just in capital expenditure, but also in social expenditure. And that's something which I felt clearly this budget has not done so.
So, talking about roads and railways infrastructure, some people are accusing and leveling allegation against the government that it's election budget. Why? Because most of the roads and railways infrastructure has been announced for states that are going to have elections like Kerala, Assam, West Bengal, and others. So, do you think it's an election budget, or what do you have to say on that?
No, but that's true. But I
Mhm.
think isn't that something which is largely true of most, I think, union budget speeches and announcements that we've seen over the last, maybe I would say 6-7 years. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it wasn't there before. Union budget speeches used to be poll bound in election years, not generally over the course of 5 years of governments running. Here I think clearly, I mean, that's something which is the part of the political economy of the way in which economic policy has been shaped under the current government. And I would go as far as to say that decisions are largely taken in a lot of cases, particularly in terms of financial allocations as well, on political priorities and principles than sound market or economic principles per se, because otherwise you would have seen a greater need for, let's say, spending in, let's say, on a program like you have Manrega for rural areas. Most of us, including myself, we've been arguing, writing about this extensively.
Yeah.
A job social security program in the urban area, in the form something similar to Manrega, was the need of the hour. It would have helped those coming back from the migrant worker crisis back to cities to get jobs in civic municipalities, right? Public works program. And government could have done a lot more than that. I mean,
Okay.
if you say that states have to do more of that, then you give the money to the states. We don't have much clarity on how much states have. There is clearly a lot more offered in allocation. That's welcome.
Yeah.
But is it enough? Because states need the money at the time of a pandemic for healthcare infrastructural requirements as well, for vaccine distribution and delivery. So, and they are cash strapped from the last year itself. Right?
So talking about vaccines, I have some figures that as per newly launched Atmanirbhar Swasth Bharat Yojana, Sitharaman allotted 35,000 crore for coronavirus vaccines in the country, and a budget of 2 lakh crore was allocated for healthcare. So do you see this budget also has more emphasis, or it has put priority on the healthcare of this country because of the pandemic?
Yeah, but that isn't that a no-brainer? If you don't do it now, when do you do it?
Yeah.
um, Healthcare was one of the most ignored segments in government priority. I will go as far as to say we had settled in our governance system for substandard and I would say inhuman public health facilities in many states. Many states, I'm saying not for all. Given the fact the idea was that a middle income class group which can afford better healthcare service would go to a private hospital like yourself, myself. And so the focus has to be on ensuring and looking at PM Ayushman Bharat and other schemes. The focus has moved from public provisioning to insurance based healthcare distribution.
Yeah, yeah.
I see this particular increase in outlay as a consequence of a pandemic, a positive, given the fact this will improve over a period of time in the long term, at least more affordable public health provisioning of services. Having said that, at the end of the day, the allocation is subject and conditional upon how states spend that money. At the end of the day, it's the states which have to improve healthcare services like you do with education as well. And there you will find, of course, states in the south, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka to a certain extent, or Andhra Pradesh, slightly bit better, or Goa for that matter, or northeastern states with slightly better healthcare infrastructure, they're likely to do better in that regard. The question you have to look at is how does this improve public healthcare distribution in services in lesser developed states, right? UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. In most of these states, there is, I mean, it's likely to be seen. But I think overall it's a net positive. Healthcare expenditure had to go up. But yeah, I mean, you would have expected that to happen.
So now talking about farmers, because I think in agriculture sector also the government has allocated around 75,100 crore to farmers for this financial year. And they also have announced increase in agriculture credit target of rupees 16.5 lakh from 2021-22. So how do you see this all? How do you read
Okay,
this
so
situation?
I have a slightly different take. I don't
Mhm.
feel that there is more government. There is very little the government can do in order to improve the structural, I think, failings of India's agricultural sector. And I'm trying to make a larger point here, which is, I think, a subject of another conversation, maybe at another
Yeah.
point of time, which is, I think, definitely responsible for the kind of agitation, distrust you're seeing between the state and the farmer. When I'm talking about the state, I'm talking about the nation state and the farmer right now. That's a consequence of the kind of treatment an average farmer has been meted to by the Indian national state. When I say that, what I mean is you can increase your allocations. At the end of the day, you have to go in, and I request you to probably do that. We've
Yeah.
done studies as part of our center as well. When you go and talk to an average farmer and do a wide sample survey with questions, they are not intricately dependent on the kind of credit that is being allocated, because the kind of logistics one has to go through in order to get even the crop insurance schemes, the PM Kisan Yojana for Bima, right, which was providing for crop insurance for failed produce. Oh, you have to look at the kind of bureaucratic delays and time processes that is there. So I think at a macro level, you may argue that, all right, that's fine. I've been arguing that maybe you need a, like you have for the monetary policy, a council, right, which
Yeah.
helps in kind of sitting. That is the MPC, Monetary Policy Committee. For MSP setting as well, you need something like that, like a committee which is a technocratic, requirement for setting up the prices of MSP for different crops, which provides a certain basic incentives as a price floor, right, and a basic price for farmers to get some incentives. There's a reason why farmers in Punjab and Haryana
A
are
protest.
protesting,
Mhm.
right? And particularly in Punjab, because these are states where MSP is a major issue.
It was guaranteed. Yeah.
It's an
Mhm.
electoral issue,
Yeah.
and it's also a major issue for farmers to get their basic prices on goods, not at the states. So which is a statement on how less the average farmer is dependent on such allocation. So I'll not read into it too much.
Yeah.
We need to look at a lot of other things. I think overall agricultural productivity is enhanced over the past year, and I think that is largely connected not with more allocations of funds that the government is providing, but with better monsoon and acclimatized conditions. Our agriculture is still, if you'll go in not to the greener pastures, but to the main areas for agriculture produce, they're still dependent on monsoon and rainfest having. So that's something which I would say we shouldn't really kind of get too bogged down with.
So the government has also announced to take borrowing of rupees 80,000 crore for the remaining 2 months to meet financial year expenditure. Now the government has announced to borrow the money. Do you think that is good decision or a step at this point in time when the economy is already in shambles and it's in a bad shape?
Yeah, well, I mean, but where do you what I mean? That's, if you look at it, step into the shoes of the state. I mean,
Mhm.
that's all you can do. If you have to increase expenditure and you can't expect to raise taxes right away, you have to borrow. The question is, when you borrow money, what are you spending it on?
Mhm.
Am I It's like, look at it from a household question, right? Just back at your house, if you're borrowing from a friend and you're using that money to lend it to a friend who you know is not going to repay, that doesn't really help your case, because you're going to indebt yourself.
Yeah.
But if you're borrowing some money to be able to invest in an office where you can do some business, that's an investment, right? And you can get some credit for which we can make money. So it's very important that the government borrows any money that it does to be able to invest it and get some kind of a return on that investment through that borrowing that it has made. It can borrow from its future. There are ways in which, through open market operations, it can borrow that money. The RBI assists in that operations. It has other external ways of borrowing. So we have to look at different channels. It's good. One of the good things that I really liked about today's speech of the finance minister, after a really long time, there was a certain degree of honesty in the way in which there was honesty in making numbers on aggregates more transparent. What I mean
Okay.
by saying is there was clear emphasis on how much capital expenditure is going to go up by. There was an emphasis on an acknowledgement that fiscal deficit is for 21, FY21 going to go up to 9.5%. That's good. If you're saying that things as the way it is, it means then you have to take the next step to moving towards a fiscal consolidation plan. So the FRBM, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, you have to look at the details to understand. I think this is going to be a challenge for the government. There is a tendency, and this is very difficult, particularly in the Indian economic history, which you can see post-independent. Once you increase government spending, particularly towards social expenditure, it's very difficult to roll it back because it becomes a major electoral issue then. So I think there the government, it seems they're trying to strike a balance that they want to spend more on capital expenditure to boost and crowd in private investment. It hasn't happened in the past 3 years. It didn't happen before the pandemic. The national infrastructure pipeline was put in, but most projects were debt clogged. There was a huge amount of debt underwritten by companies. There were companies which were willing to borrow, but they said there is less demand. So you want me to construct a new housing society, but there are no consumers buying those properties.
Yeah.
So there are a number of those issues which you have to
Yeah.
look at in terms
Yeah.
of borrowing.
So, sir,
Long story short, just to
yeah,
conclude on that,
yeah.
borrowing is fine in a time of a crisis, but you need to use that borrowing for purposes of investment than unproductive expenditure.
Okay, so you're worried about where these borrowings will be used rather than why it has been borrowed. Okay, so sir, in allocations in the sector of education has been reduced by, if I go by the figures, 6.13%. So in the last budget, it was around 99,312 crore, and this time it is 93,224 crore. How do you see this? Why this decrease in the education allocation and the expenditure?
I think it's difficult to look at the why. That's a question for the
Mhm.
finance ministry and
Mhm.
the community
Yeah,
to
but
look at.
as an
But
economist, how do you read this whole situation? I mean,
I see it as an extension of a practice of a government which has clearly not prioritized education
mhm.
since it has come into power in its first term. I'll be honest. Education has been put at the back burner, and most cases the union government has a stronger say in areas of higher education possibilities, and we know the condition of the higher education landscape today, in terms of how deeply dependent is an average student on the private segment, or otherwise, if you have the money, you'd end up going abroad to get your higher education possibilities done. And the state of government schooling in maybe across states has largely been remained unaffected, barring very few cases. I think Delhi is perhaps one of those cases of a remarkable transformation seen in government schooling under the I think AAP government, which focused heavily. I mean, you should look at what state budgets have done
Mhm.
that have increased. I think it's a very good maybe a study for your platform to look at how state spending in education and healthcare over a period of 10 years has
So,
yielded
so
to
I'm sorry to
certain.
cut you, sir. Like, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are you happy with the allocation in terms of education, or like, is it problematic?
Yeah, I think it's less for me to say I'm happy with it or not, but let's look at it from the condition of the people, right?
Mhm.
Is it fair to have a lower allocation education in a year when institutions have been cash strapped? They don't have clearly the infrastructure for going online.
Yeah.
You have not done much to reopen, or make students feel safe. And I would go as far as to say that in rural areas, particularly, if I had to estimate, um, just at the top of my head, almost 50 to 60% of students have gone out of education entirely. And I'm giving you a very conservative figure.
Yeah.
The way I'm seeing it, I think it's far, far worse. So clearly, the answer would be in the affirmative of yes, there could have been more done.
So, on the front of job creation and generation in this country, because this country has seen huge number of job loss because of the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, Do you think the government has done or justified steps or done something satisfactorily in terms of creating jobs and generating employment in the country?
So that's the first point that I'd made earlier. I
Mhm.
think that the emphasis is on kickstarting growth through greater capital spending, and the expectation or the hope is that private sector would increase spending as well, and investment, which would allow jobs to be created in areas of construction, manufacturing. It, as I said, it hasn't happened in the past few years because the private sector has been saying, where is the demand for us to invest?
Mhm.
And we keep going back to the same circles again and again, that you're trying to address a demand side problem through a supply side solution, which is by giving more money and spending. Most growth in India before the pandemic was being financed and sourced through government spending, which is to say it was not coming, if you take the basic metric of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right, which composes growth, right, in basic accounting terms, most was coming from the G element, right? So it is still going to come in from that G element if the aggressive spending for government is going to allow for infrastructure. That will not help your job problem, because the level of job creation requirement for the newly entering population of the youth coming into the workforce participation process is needs to be far higher, right? And we have, on the contrary, a situation of high level of joblessness with the rate of unemployment that we're seeing. So I would say that there was not even one mention of the kind of problem we're facing on unemployment. I think this was, you can go to the speech and see there's no mention of employment and unemployment as a crisis problem. I think
So there's no
that is a
much
worry.
emphasis on that, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's far more worrying if you don't acknowledge the problem and you're living in denial, because unless you don't acknowledge it, how is that you start addressing it by looking at some kind of a solution in sight? I've argued that as a proposal, policy plan, John Reyes has argued about this as well. An urban focused job creation program will have really helped. This could
So,
have
sir,
been tied.
am I right in understanding that there is no much emphasis and importance given on job creation?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sir, the last question I would like to ask from you is what are the two failures of this whole budget and two major victories, if one were to categorize, according to you?
No, I think so. We should avoid this exercise. I mean, I'll encourage you to kind of look at the finer. It's an accounting statement at the
Yeah.
end of the day. I do value the government to be more aggressive on spending.
Okay.
I wish from what it had done on capital expenditure, it would have done the same in spirit to social expenditure. That I would have imagined would have happened if there was a Lok Sabha election this year.
Okay.
If there was a Lok Sabha election this year, maybe it would have not, just put in more money in West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, but at a national level in social spending. So it's smart enough there to realize that it doesn't really need to do that much of spending. So I think there was a clear prospect of doing more there. As I said earlier, job creation possibilities could have been enhanced through more targeted spending. Education was clearly ignored. We also have a situation, I think, on the side of creating more personal income tax breaks for the lower middle income group. I think it could have been done. You could have exempted maybe for a year's period as personal income tax break. Now, a lot of people ask the question, where do you create the money for that, or what happens? The answer to that is you could have included a cess, like a temporary tax, on what you call as the ultra rich, the top 5%, which is what you'd call as the Ambani Adani class. I think that would have been fine for 1 year. If you have like a 1 or 2% cess, or as a, I mean, I'm not using the word wealth tax, but a COVID consumption tax or cess, that would have helped you create more redistribution. So I think in terms of looking at binaries of failure and victories, I think the hype and expectation from the government was to do more to those worst impacted. I think there is clearly not much of that done. Having said that, I think on emphasizing on a pro-growth outlook, being more honest with your numbers, that's welcome.
Okay. So, just a quick question: how much would you give on a scale of 10 to this budget? Just a quick random.
Maybe I think
Looking at all the factors.
yeah, I would say a 6. I would say a 6.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you so much, sir, for talking to us. Thank
Okay.
you so much for
Thank
talking
you.
to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shubham.